Welcome to the U.S. Eagle Claw channel. The armies of Ukraine and Russia continue to harm each other with various attacks. The Ukrainian army is trying to advance against the Russian troops. However, Russian troops want to block the Ukrainian army with long-range weapons. After Vladimir Putin announced the annexation of 4 regions, Ukrainian troops stepped up their attacks on the annexed areas. The Kremlin government procured missiles and suicide drones from Iran and North Korea and attacked civilian areas and infrastructures. With these attacks, the Kremlin government aimed to prevent the Ukrainian army from liberating the annexed areas and to shift the focus of the Ukrainian government to civilians. However, what happened at the front did not turn out as the Kremlin government had predicted. Ukrainian forces managed to stop many of the Russian attacks targeting civilians in the air. At the same time, experienced and well-equipped Ukrainian troops continued their advance against the untrained and unequipped Russian troops sent by the Kremlin government to the front as part of mobilization. The Russian army, which could not get the desired efficiency from the mobilized soldiers, wanted to expose the Ukrainian civilians to the bad conditions of the war by directing their long-range weapons to the regions where the civilian population was concentrated. Russian forces continue their long-range artillery fire along the front line that vertically divides eastern Ukraine in two. The target of the Russian army is especially the Kherson and Bakhmut regions. The two regions mentioned are strategic areas that can change the course of the war. In the Kherson direction, Russian forces are holding the defensive line. Russian forces subjected more than 10 settlements to long-range artillery attacks, including Oskorivka, Zolota Balka, Dutchani in the Kherson region and near the city of Kherson. Russian forces are trying to resume offensive activities in the Liman, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka directions. The Russian forces aim to defend the temporarily occupied lands with the offensive operations they're trying to carry out in these regions. However, the Russian troops, who were not successful with their attacks against the Ukrainian forces, could not escape from losses. The victorious Ukrainian fighters destroyed up to 20 pieces of Russian military equipment and wounded about 70 invaders in their area along the line of contact between the Ukrainian and Russian armies. On the front, where the warm contact of the Ukrainian and Russian armies continued, 21 Russian soldiers left their positions. 13 soldiers among those fleeing the front were sent to prison. Subsequently, the command of the Russian troops was decided by the military court to kill those who violated it. After this decision, it was stated that all deserters were eliminated. If the soldiers in the Russian army escape, the Russians are neutralized by the Ukrainians if they do not. It was stated that the Ukrainian Defense Forces carried out 14 attacks on the areas where aviation, personnel, weapons, and military equipment are concentrated, as well as 2 attacks on the points where anti-aircraft missile systems of the Russian army are deployed. Ukrainian rocket and artillery forces destroyed the command center of the Russian army, 2 military personnel collection areas, and ammunition depots. Along with the ongoing fighting along the line of contact between Ukrainian and Russian forces, Ukrainian troops have returned to their nests Ukrainian soldiers who were prisoners of the Russian army in their newly liberated lands. A Ukrainian special battalion called Angels rescued 2 POWs from an area currently occupied by Russian invaders but not fully confirmed. Prisoners of war were directed to the Coordination Center for treatment. Coordination Center member Ihor Kopitin stated that this was not the first time prisoners of war were rescued, but the first operation he could talk about. Kopitin emphasized that the first aid was given to the wounded soldiers at the Coordination Center. One video showed Ukrainian soldiers captured by Russian soldiers forcibly put on Russian uniforms during captivity and burned their Russian uniforms after returning to a safe place. Prisoner exchange processes between Russia and Ukraine accelerated as Ukrainian forces continued to liberate Russian-occupied territories. Recently, 60 Russian POWs were returned to Ukrainian territory. With this change, the brutal face of the Russian army emerged. Captured Ukrainian soldiers brought into Ukrainian territory are being treated at a hospital in northeastern Ukraine. After initial examinations of the prisoners were made, the nurses were instructed to give each soldier more than 300 millimeters of chicken soup, or about 20 tablespoons. The hospital director stated that many of them were very malnourished during the Russian captivity and did not have the strength to digest anymore. Besides the soldiers killed or wounded in the war, the prisoners of war are people whose fate is uncertain and their condition is little known. Looking at the situation of the Russian prisoners who were brought back to life in Ukraine, it is clear that the Russian army did not hesitate to commit another war crime. Although prisoners of war are required to be protected by the Geneva Conventions, which require humane treatment, the physical conditions of Ukrainian soldiers who have been imprisoned for a long time in the hands of Russian soldiers include protruding shoulders, bandaged limbs, and long scars. In addition to being imprisoned for a long time, it is seen that the injuries that occurred during the war of the prisoners were not treated and caused traumas. Soldiers who survived stated that they were beaten with clubs and begged to die in tears. The soldiers pointed out that their urine was bloody because they were exposed to so much violence. It is stated by the survivors that the Russian forces hanged the Ukrainian prisoners with handcuffs to make them talk. While the Russian-Ukrainian war, which we predict will come to a standstill with the winter season, is accelerating, the prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine are accelerating at the same rate. In the first 6-month period of the war between Ukraine and Russia, 574 convicted Ukrainian soldiers were released, while 817 soldiers have been released by the Russians since September. We see that the prisoner exchange between Ukraine and Russia have accelerated almost 5 times. Soldiers returning to Ukraine are greeted with joy and celebration by the families and friends of the soldiers. In addition, returning soldiers are a beacon of hope for families, relatives, spouses, and friends whose loved ones are still imprisoned or missing. But the prisoner exchange between Ukrainian and Russian forces could point to more than one outcome. The return of the prisoners of war will bring relief for the senior commanders of the army. In addition, the Russian military can rebuild and strengthen the supply chain during these changes, which makes it a short-term goodwill gesture. As long as the situation is allowed, incoming soldiers could bring bad luck for the Ukrainian army. At the same time, the Russian military, due to the disconnected supply chain, is not able to provide basic life support for even its own units as well as prisoners. Keeping thousands of prisoners of war indefinitely will increase this burden on the Russian army. When we look at it from this perspective, we see that there's been a great decrease in the resources of the Russian army. The holding of prisoners would potentially pose an economic and logistical hazard to the parties of war. While the Russian economy has been hit hard by Western sanctions, the Ukrainian economy suffers from the incessant Russian bombardment of its energy infrastructure. It is not known exactly how many prisoners were held by the Ukrainian and Russian forces. It is seen that all the soldiers captured by the Russian army were subjected to physical and psychological violence and torture. While thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are counting the days to escape as part of the prisoner exchanges, their families, who have not heard from them for a long time, are trying to get information about them from newly arrived soldiers. However, this information is often not what the families want.